The groom left me at the altar for another woman, so I improvised. I stood at the altar for 2 whole hours in my wedding dress, waiting and waiting for my fiancé to arrive. Everyone in attendance was giving me the same pitiful, sorry, it's time to give up kind of look. Even the priest was telling me to get out. Just then my phone buzzed. Sorry, can't make it. Can't make it? That's all he had to say after making me humiliate myself for 2 hours? Just when I thought it couldn't get worse, his best man looked at the floor and apologized to me, admitting he knew my fiancé wasn't going to show up. He'd met someone new at that last business conference. Everyone was outraged. Our families broke out into fights while I stood there stunned. When I got home, I found his note on the counter. Keep the ring. Sell it to fund your little cooking hobby. The same cooking hobby he had called embarrassingly stupid and a waste of time just a few days before. And now he's telling me to fund it with a ring I helped pay for? Fine. I crumpled up the note and spent all night finally planning out something I'd wanted to do. Start my own French frying business. I always hated how fries tasted all the same, just salty and no originality, and came up with a new menu full of crazy flavors. Rotisserie chicken-flavored French fries, fries that tasted like hot dogs but 100 times healthier, even dessert fries where you can dip them into vanilla sundaes. So I finally pulled out my dusty old notebook full of recipes and whipped up my first batch. I bought my own little food truck and set up shop at the park. I was sad at first when no one wanted to text out my food, but soon 1 line turned to 5. Then to 30 people, and soon the line for my food truck wrapped around and almost reached the entrance. One little kid who tried my cotton candy fries screamed out, "I want this every day," while he walked back into the line for seconds. Meanwhile, my ex immediately started the struggle. His business apparently started failing, and somehow he blamed it on me, saying that I must have done something right before I left. How I wanted to sabotage him for choosing someone else. He wasn't wrong. Before he left me for another woman, I'd been the one running his business while he reaped all the benefits. I managed his book, handled his staff schedules, kept all his vendors happy. I handled all the problems with customers while all the money went straight to his pockets. And now that I wasn't around, his business was on the brink of bankruptcy. And to make things sweeter, his side piece, the one he was sure would be better for business, left him at the altar too. That's when I met Ian, a guy who quickly became one of my regular customers. He owned several buildings downtown and was supposedly showing me potential restaurant spaces. But he always stayed for lunch and always ordering the newest thing from the menu. "Your ideas are incredible. I have no idea how you even come up with them," he sang before stuffing his face full of flavored French fries. But I completely understood his surprise. I mean, dessert fries? Who would have thought they'd be such a smash hit for everyone? But I was just thankful to have people who enjoyed a bit of crazy too. One afternoon, Ian showed up during a crazy lunch rush. I was completely frazzled, covered in fry oil, and had just dropped an entire batch of my new strawberry cheesecake fries. "Bad timing?" he asked, and I nearly cried from frustration. But instead of leaving, he rolled up his sleeves and started helping me bag orders. "You don't have to do that," I said, but he just shrugged and said, "My meetings can wait." For the next hour, he worked beside me, making jokes about my crazy flavor combinations while perfectly remembering every regular's usual order. When the rush finally died down, we sat on the curb sharing a basket of my experimental chocolate pretzel fries, and I felt something shift between us. After a week of chatting, Ian came up with an incredible idea. Expansion, franchising, the whole 9 yards. "If you're willing to give it a shot, I'll do everything to make it happen." My heart raced with excitement. I instantly agreed. And for the rest of the year, that's what we focused on, getting the brand and menu out there for everyone to enjoy. By Christmas, we had 5 other trucks, 1 office building, and 3 restaurants all spread across the country. However, when my ex heard about my success, he was shocked, texting me, "Hey, I tried one of your fries earlier today and they definitely tasted better than before. Did you finally take cooking classes?" Well, anyway, I was texting to make you an offer. See if you wanted to collab and help me reopen my restaurant. I almost burst into laughter at his message. After leaving me at the altar, he still had the audacity to speak to me like I was still less than him. I quickly blocked his number and focused on me and Ian's upcoming wedding. But then he showed up to my food truck, looking angrier than ever. He kicked at the truck and tried yelling at the customers, warning them that the food was poisonous, but they all just ignored him, waving over an officer to help handle the situation. He was quickly removed from the park, but I knew he wouldn't stop there. He showed up again a week later, but this time he wasn't alone. He'd brought someone I thought was still left rotting in jail. Winston stood right next to my ex like they planned this whole thing together. My stomach dropped when I recognized his face from old photos my ex used to show me, the business partner who got sent to prison for fraud 3 years ago. My ex had this smug look on his face like he just won something big, while Winston just stared at me with these cold eyes that made my skin crawl. This wasn't some random visit. They came here together on purpose to scare me. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone and texted Ian first, then Dean, trying to keep my face calm even though I felt like throwing up. A customer asked me for extra ketchup and I almost dropped the whole container because my fingers wouldn't stop shaking. I forced myself to smile and hand over the ketchup packets, then went back to filling orders like nothing was wrong even though my ex and Winston were still standing there watching me. Ian showed up in less than 20 minutes and positioned himself near the truck where I could see him, and just knowing he was there made my breathing slow down a little. He didn't say anything to my ex or Winston, just stood there with his arms crossed, looking protective. Dean called me back while I was bagging someone's order of bacon cheddar fries and told me to document everything. Don't talk to them at all and meet him at his office in 2 hours. I took a photo of my ex and Winston standing together near my truck, making sure to get both their faces clear in the shot. They finally left after about 10 more minutes, probably because Ian was there, and other customers were starting to notice them just standing around staring. I finished the lunch rush on autopilot, my mind racing the whole time about what they were planning. 2 hours later, I sat in Dean's office describing Winston's whole history, how he and my ex had run some kind of fraud scheme together, and Winston took the fall while my ex somehow stayed out of prison. Dean listened carefully and took notes, then explained that bringing a convicted criminal to harass me at my business actually helped our case a lot. He started typing up an emergency motion right there, citing the pattern of my ex showing up and escalating his tactics, plus Winston's criminal background as proof that I was facing a real threat. Dean said judges take this kind of thing seriously when someone brings their ex-con buddy to intimidate their ex at work. He promised to file the motion first thing in the morning and push for a hearing as soon as possible. That evening, Ian came over to my apartment with his laptop, and we started searching for information about Winston's parole conditions. It took us almost an hour of digging through county records and court documents, but we finally found what we needed. Winston wasn't supposed to be involved in any business activities at all, and he definitely wasn't allowed to hang around with his old partners in crime, which included my ex since they got convicted together. Ian took screenshots of everything while I called Dean and left him a message with what we found. Dean called back within 15 minutes, sounding excited about the information. He said he would file a report with Winston's parole officer first thing in the morning, documenting that Winston showed up at my business location with my ex. The parole officer called Dean back later that night and confirmed she would open an investigation into whether Winston violated his release terms. I couldn't sleep at all that night. Every little sound made me jump up and check the windows. I must have checked the locks on my doors 5 times before midnight. Around 3 in the morning, I finally gave up on sleeping and just sat on my couch with all the lights on, waiting for the sun to come up. When morning finally came, I felt like a zombie. But I forced myself to get ready and head to the truck because I refused to let fear shut down what I built. Ian showed up at the park before I even finished setting up, carrying 2 cups of coffee and a bag of bagels. He offered to stay nearby all day, and I was too rattled to argue or pretend I was fine. Having him there made me feel safer, even though I hated needing that protection. Dean called around noon with an update that made me feel a tiny bit better. The court granted an emergency hearing for the following week, and Winston's parole officer scheduled a compliance meeting to investigate the violation. But then Dean's voice got more serious, and he told me my ex's lawyer sent over a threatening letter that morning. The letter claimed I was harassing his client by filing what they called frivolous legal actions, like I was the problem here instead of the person who kept showing up to bother me. Dean said not to worry because he was already writing a response with a full timeline of every documented incident, showing clearly who was actually doing the harassing. He sounded confident that the judge would see through my ex's attempt to flip the situation around. I called Brittany that afternoon and asked her to meet me at the main restaurant location to talk about safety. We sat in the back office and I explained everything that happened with Winston showing up. Brittany's face got really serious and she immediately started talking about protocols we needed at all the truck locations, not just mine. We spent 2 hours working out a buddy system where nobody would work alone anymore, especially during opening and closing. Brittany suggested installing panic buttons in all the trucks that connected straight to the local police, and I approved the cost right away, even though it would be expensive. We also created a contact tree so if something happened at one location, everyone else would know about it immediately. Brittany said she would also look into getting security cameras installed at each truck, and I told her to make it happen as fast as possible. The emergency hearing finally arrived after the longest week of my life. I sat in the courtroom wearing my most professional outfit, trying to look calm and confident even though my stomach was doing flips. When it was my turn to testify, I described the whole pattern starting from that horrible day at the altar, then the note he left, then blocking his number, then him showing up at my truck multiple times, and finally bringing Winston. My ex's lawyer kept trying to make me look like I was just being vindictive, asking questions about whether I was jealous of his new relationship or angry about the business. But Dean had prepared me for this, and I stayed calm, answering each question with simple facts instead of getting emotional. Then Dean presented his timeline with dates, photos, police reports, and witness statements showing I only asked for legal protection after my ex repeatedly harassed me. The judge looked at all the evidence and extended the restraining order to include Winston, plus increased the protected distance from 100 feet to 500 feet. Walking out of that courtroom, I felt like I could finally breathe again. 2 days later, Dean called with news that actually made me smile. Winston's parole officer contacted him to report that Winston definitely violated his parole by hanging around with my ex, who was his co-conspirator in the original fraud case. Winston was facing a parole revocation hearing and would probably get sent back to prison. The parole officer even thanked Dean for the documentation we provided because it made her investigation easier. For the first time in weeks, I felt like the justice system was actually working instead of just making me jump through hoops. That weight I'd been carrying around in my chest finally lifted a little bit. With the immediate threat reduced, I could finally focus on running my actual business again instead of just surviving. I started going through our financial reports and discovered something alarming. Our food costs had crept up by 18% over the past 3 months, and I hadn't even noticed because I was so distracted by the legal drama. Brittany came over that weekend, and we spent 2 whole days analyzing every single ingredient purchase, looking for patterns in the numbers. We found that inconsistent portioning across all our locations was killing our profit margins. One truck would use way more potatoes per order than another truck, or someone would give extra toppings without charging for them. We needed to standardize everything without losing the quality that made us successful in the first place, which was going to be a huge challenge. The next week, I spent every evening at my kitchen table creating detailed guides for every single menu item we sold. I took photos of each portion size from multiple angles, weighed everything on my digital scale, and wrote out exact measurements for potatoes, toppings, and sauces. My apartment looked like a food photography studio with ring lights and white backgrounds everywhere. Brittany helped me format everything into laminated reference cards that could hang in each truck and restaurant kitchen. Then I sent out emails to all staff across every location scheduling mandatory training sessions over the next 2 weeks. The responses came back mixed. Some people replied right away saying they understood why this was needed. Others took days to respond and their messages felt cold and short. I knew this was going to be rough. The first training session happened at our main restaurant on a Tuesday morning before opening. 15 staff members showed up and I could see the frustration on several faces before I even started talking. I walked everyone through the new portioning guides, explaining how we measured each item and why consistency mattered. One of our longtime truck operators crossed his arms and said this felt too corporate, like we were becoming some boring chain restaurant that cared more about numbers than customers. Another employee said the new system removed all their creativity and made them feel like robots just following orders. I took a deep breath and explained that consistent portions protected our reputation and their jobs. If we gave away too much product, we'd go out of business and everyone would lose their income. If portions varied too much between locations, customers would feel cheated and stop coming. I could see some people nodding, but others still looked angry and unconvinced. The training felt tense and uncomfortable instead of collaborative like I'd hoped. After the session ended and most people left, Marco hung back near the door looking like he wanted to say something. He kept glancing at me, then looking away, shifting his weight from foot to foot. Finally, he walked over and asked if we could talk privately. We went into the small office at the back of the restaurant and he closed the door. Marco admitted he'd been letting customers guilt him into bigger portions when they complained about serving sizes. Someone would say the portion looked small compared to last time, or they'd mention they were really hungry and he'd just add extra fries or toppings without charging. He thought he was providing good customer service by being generous and making people happy. But now, after seeing the numbers and understanding how it hurt the business, he realized he was actually causing problems. His honesty caught me off guard. I thanked him for telling me and said I appreciated his willingness to admit mistakes. Then I realized this was exactly why the training wasn't working. I'd taught people how to measure portions, but not how to handle difficult customers who pushed back against those portions. We needed better training on dealing with complaints and requests for extra food without just giving product away. I made a note to add customer service scenarios to the next training sessions, with scripts people could use when customers tried to guilt them. 2 days later, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. It was Chloe, the food writer who'd covered our business months ago when we were still pretty new. She said she wanted to do a follow-up story about our expansion and the challenges we'd faced while growing. My stomach dropped. Given everything happening with my ex and the legal drama, the last thing I wanted was more attention. I told her I needed to think about it and would call her back. That evening, I talked to Brittany about whether we should do the interview. I was worried Chloe would focus on all the harassment and court stuff instead of the actual business. Brittany pointed out that controlling our own narrative was better than letting rumors fill the empty space. People were probably already talking and making up stories. At least if we did the interview, we could tell the truth on our own terms. She had a good point. I called Chloe back the next day and agreed to the interview, but only if she focused on business challenges and not my personal life. Chloe said she understood, and we set up a time to meet at the main restaurant. The interview happened on a quiet Wednesday afternoon between lunch and dinner rush. Chloe showed up with a voice recorder and a notebook, looking professional but friendly. We started talking about expansion, staffing challenges, and supply chain issues. I felt comfortable discussing the operational side of growing the business. Then Chloe shifted in her seat and said she needed to ask about the harassment incidents, because they were part of public court records. My heart started beating faster, but I'd prepared for this with Brittany. I gave a brief, factual statement about seeking legal protection from an ex-partner who'd been showing up at business locations. I emphasized that the courts had validated my concerns by granting restraining orders. Then I redirected back to business topics, mentioning how we'd implemented safety protocols across all locations. Chloe respected my boundaries and didn't push for more personal details. She shifted focus to questions about supply chain problems and staffing difficulties. For the first time in months, I felt heard rather than used. She was treating me like a real business owner with legitimate challenges, not just someone with dramatic personal problems. The The article came out in the local food section 2 weeks later with the headline, "From Food Truck to Small Chain, The Real Challenges of Scaling a Concept." I read it 3 times, looking for problems or misquotes. But Chloe had written something balanced and honest. She mentioned the legal issues in one short paragraph, but dedicated most of the space to operational challenges and our creative flavors. She quoted me talking about portion control, staff training, and finding reliable suppliers. The piece made us sound professional and thoughtful instead of dramatic. Within hours of the article posting online, my email inbox filled up with messages from other food entrepreneurs. They shared their own struggles with scaling, staffing problems, and dealing with inconsistent suppliers. Some asked for advice about training programs or finding good vendors. I spent that evening responding to messages and realized I was building a real professional network, beyond just customers who liked our food. These were people who understood the actual work of running food businesses. 3 days after the article published, Dean called to tell me my ex had sent another message through his lawyer. This time he was claiming the article defamed him by mentioning the restraining order. I felt tired more than scared. Would this ever actually end? Dean sounded calm and almost amused. He explained that factual reporting of public court records wasn't defamation. You can't sue someone for stating true facts that are part of official legal documents anyone can access. Dean sent a response warning that continued frivolous legal threats could result in harassment charges. After that, the threats stopped, at least for a while. I went back to focusing on the business, grateful for Dean's steady presence handling all the legal nonsense. Then our main potato supplier called with news that made my stomach sink. They were doubling their prices starting next month due to crop failures in their growing region. We'd relied on them for 6 months, and their potatoes were perfect for our recipes. Brittany and I immediately started calling other suppliers, requesting samples from 4 different vendors. We spent 3 days testing potatoes, cooking batch after batch, and comparing texture, flavor, and how they held up to our various seasonings. 2 suppliers had potatoes that were too watery and made soggy fries. 1 had potatoes that were fine but inconsistent in size, making it hard to get uniform cuts. The 4th supplier had good quality but limited quantities available. We made the decision to split our orders between 2 suppliers to avoid depending on any single source. It meant more complicated logistics with multiple deliveries and different payment schedules. But it reduced our risk of getting stuck if one supplier had problems. The supply chain mess forced us to temporarily remove 2 specialty items from the menu because we couldn't source the specific potato varieties they required. Our honey butter sweet potato fries and purple majesty fries both needed potatoes that none of our new suppliers carried. I posted an explanation on social media about agricultural realities and crop availability, promising the items would return when supply got better. Some customers were understanding and supportive. Others left angry comments accusing us of selling out and losing our unique identity. One person wrote that we'd become just another corporate chain that cared more about money than quality. Reading those comments hurt even though I knew they weren't fair. We were trying to maintain quality while dealing with real supply problems beyond our control. That same week, Ian and I had our first serious fight about business decisions. We were at my apartment going over supplier quotes when he suggested we could solve the whole problem by switching to frozen pre-cut fries instead of fresh potatoes. I felt my face get hot with anger. I couldn't believe he'd even proposed compromising our core identity like that. Fresh-cut fries were literally what made us different from every other fry place. That was the whole point of everything we'd built. Ian got frustrated and said I wasn't being practical. We had a supply problem and he was offering a solution, but I was too stubborn to even consider it. We both said things we shouldn't have. I told him he didn't understand what made the business special, and he was just thinking about money like every other investor. He said I was being unrealistic and refusing to adapt to problems. Finally, he grabbed his jacket and left without saying goodbye. I spent that night lying awake wondering if mixing business and romance had been a huge mistake. Maybe we should have kept things professional instead of getting personally involved. The next morning, I woke up to knocking on my door. Ian stood there holding a bag of fresh bagels and looking genuinely sorry. He came in and immediately apologized, saying he'd been thinking like a real estate investor focused on profit margins instead of understanding what made the business work. He asked me to explain why fresh-cut potatoes mattered so much to our concept. I walked him through everything, from how different potato varieties affected flavor, to how the cut style changed texture, to how our cooking method worked specifically with fresh potatoes. I explained that frozen fries were already cooked once before freezing, so they'd never have the same taste or texture as our fresh-cut approach. Ian listened without interrupting, actually trying to understand my perspective instead of just arguing. When I finished, he nodded and said he got it now. He'd been treating it like any other business decision about cost versus benefit, but this was about the fundamental identity of what we were building. We couldn't compromise on fresh cut without becoming something completely different. That night, we stayed up talking about how to keep our relationship from getting tangled up in business stress. Ian suggested we have separate meetings for work stuff versus personal stuff, and I agreed that sounded smart. We decided that for any big business decisions where we disagreed, we'd bring Brittany in to break the tie since she understood operations better than either of us. For relationship problems, we promised to talk about them right away, instead of letting them build up until they exploded during a business discussion. It felt less romantic than I expected, more like we were signing a contract than planning a future together, but it also felt solid and real. Like we were actually building something that could last instead of just hoping everything would work out. The next morning, I texted Brittany about our new system, and she responded with 3 thumbs up emojis, which made me laugh because she'd probably been waiting for us to figure this out. 3 weeks later, Dean called with news about Winston's parole hearing. I was at the main truck prepping for lunch when my phone rang, and I almost dropped a basket of fries when Dean told me Winston was going back to prison for 6 months. The parole board found that showing up at my business location with my ex violated the restraining order, plus Winston wasn't supposed to be associating with his old fraud partner at all. Dean explained this was actually huge for our safety because Winston was clearly the more dangerous one, the guy with actual criminal experience and connections. My ex was just an angry loser, but Winston knew how to really hurt people. With him locked up again, my ex was basically alone and powerless. I felt something unclench in my chest that I hadn't even realized was tight. Dean reminded me the restraining order was still active and I should keep documenting everything, but his tone was way more relaxed than before. 2 days after Winston went back to prison, Ian called me sounding annoyed. His receptionist had just called security on someone trying to get into his office, and when Ian checked the security footage, it was my ex. Apparently he'd walked in claiming he wanted to talk about leasing commercial space, but Ian's receptionist recognized him from photos I'd shared during our early dates. She'd hit the panic button under her desk, and security escorted him out before he even made it past the lobby. Ian documented everything with timestamps and photos from the security cameras, then sent it all to Dean. I couldn't believe my ex was stupid enough to try this, especially right after Winston got sent back for violating the same restraining order. Dean filed another violation report with the court that same afternoon. The contempt hearing happened 2 weeks later at the courthouse downtown. I didn't have to attend this one since it was about my ex violating the order, not about me needing protection. Dean called me afterward with an update. My ex's lawyer had tried arguing that his client was pursuing legitimate business interests and had no idea it was Ian's office. But Dean had done his homework and presented evidence showing my ex had specifically researched Ian's business address online and chosen that location despite there being dozens of other real estate offices closer to where my ex lived. The judge wasn't buying the innocent mistake story. She found him in contempt, slapped him with a $2,500 fine, and warned that any future violations would result in jail time. Dean sounded satisfied when he told me, and I felt this weird mix of relief and exhaustion. How many times did we have to go through this before my ex finally gave up? I scheduled a therapy session with Angelique specifically to talk about the upcoming holidays. Thanksgiving was 3 weeks away, and I was already feeling anxious about family gatherings where relatives would ask about my failed wedding. I sat in Angelique's office picking at my cuticles while I explained how much I dreaded those conversations. She helped me prepare responses that set boundaries without sounding defensive or rude. We spent half the session role-playing different scenarios. She'd pretend to be my nosy aunt asking when I was going to find someone new, and I'd practice saying calmly that I was focusing on my business and personal growth right now. We went through it over and over until I could say the words without my voice shaking or my face getting hot. Angelique reminded me that I didn't owe anyone details about my personal life, and that saying I'd rather not discuss it was a complete sentence. I didn't need to explain or justify or make excuses. Just set the boundary and change the subject. By the end of the session, I felt more prepared, though still nervous. Thanksgiving dinner at my parents' house was awkward but manageable. I used every strategy Angelique and I had practiced. My aunt made one pointed comment about me still being single, and I took a breath before responding that I was focusing on my business and personal growth right now. She looked like she wanted to push further, but my mom changed the subject to ask about the food truck expansion. Ian joined us for dessert, and watching my family's warm reception of him helped ease some of my anxiety. My dad asked him about real estate markets, and my mom kept refilling his coffee, and nobody made weird comments about us dating too soon after my failed wedding. Ian fit in naturally, laughing at my uncle's bad jokes and helping clear plates without being asked. Driving home that night, I felt grateful that the day hadn't been the disaster I'd imagined. December hit like a freight train. All 3 truck locations plus our 2 small restaurants got slammed with customers buying gift cards and placing catering orders for office parties. We hired 6 seasonal staff members to handle the volume, but training them quickly while maintaining our quality standards was exhausting. I was working 14-hour days, barely sleeping, running between locations to check on operations and help during rush periods. Ian started leaving concerned voicemails about me burning out, but I couldn't slow down during our busiest season. Every night, I'd fall into bed too tired to even take my shoes off properly. Brittany was working just as hard, covering shifts when people called in sick and handling vendor orders and managing schedules. We'd text each other at midnight, comparing notes and making plans for the next day. The money was good, but the exhaustion was real. The Saturday before Christmas, disaster struck at our main truck location. I was working the fryer when it started making a weird grinding noise, then just died completely. No heat, no nothing. We had a line of 40 people waiting, and I wanted to cry from frustration. Instead, I grabbed Marco and we worked together to redirect customers to our nearest restaurant location 2 blocks away. We handed out free order vouchers to everyone in line for their trouble, apologizing over and over while people grumbled about the wait. The fryer repair guy said it would cost $3,000 and take 3 days to fix, hitting us right during our most profitable week of the year. I approved the expense because we had no choice, then spent the rest of the day at the restaurant location helping handle the unexpected crowd we'd just sent their way. Despite the equipment failure, we ended December with our highest revenue month ever. When Brittany showed me the final numbers, I couldn't believe it. We'd made enough profit to cover the fryer repair and still add a significant amount to our emergency equipment fund. Brittany immediately created a preventive maintenance schedule for all locations to reduce the chance of future breakdowns. She color-coded it and everything, with different inspection frequencies for different equipment types. Looking at her detailed spreadsheet, I realized I needed to think more like a business owner and less like someone running a food truck. Systems and planning mattered as much as recipes. You couldn't just wing it when you had multiple locations and dozens of employees depending on you. In January, my inbox had an email from Gerard Duffy, the investor who'd contacted us months ago. He had a revised proposal for funding aggressive expansion. I opened the attachment and my eyes went wide at the numbers. He wanted to open 15 locations in the next year and was offering $500,000 for 40% equity. The email talked about franchising opportunities and licensing deals and national growth potential. Part of me felt tempted by that much money and validation. But his timeline felt reckless and his vision didn't align with our careful growth approach. He wanted to move fast and scale hard, treating us like any other fast food concept. I forwarded the email to Ian with a question mark in the subject line, and he called me 5 minutes later suggesting we meet with Gerard in person, before deciding anything. 3 days later, Ian and I sat across from Gerard at a downtown coffee shop, and I could feel my stomach getting tight the second he started talking. Gerard barely looked at me when I brought up my concerns about quality control and making sure our staff got proper training. He kept turning to Ian, talking about expansion numbers and profit margins like I wasn't even there. Every time I tried to explain how important our cooking process was, or ask specific questions about how we'd maintain standards across so many new locations, Gerard waved his hand and said we could figure out those details later. He acted like the actual food part of my food business was just a small thing we'd deal with eventually. Ian kept trying to redirect Gerard's attention back to me, but Gerard just kept going, throwing out big numbers and talking about market share. When the meeting finally ended and Gerard walked away, Ian and I looked at each other for a second. Then we both said absolutely not at the exact same time and started laughing. We sat there for another hour talking about how wrong that felt, how Gerard clearly didn't understand what made our business special, and how his whole approach would destroy everything we'd built. 2 days later, I sent Gerard a polite email formally declining his investment offer. I explained that our growth strategy focused on sustainable quality rather than rapid expansion, and we didn't think our visions matched up. His response came back within an hour, and I could practically feel the attitude dripping off the screen. He wrote that we were thinking too small, that we'd regret missing this opportunity when our competitors left us behind, and that we clearly didn't understand how real business worked. I forwarded the email to Brittany, and she called me immediately cheering. She admitted that Gerard had visited one of our restaurant locations last month and given her seriously bad vibes, the way he kept criticizing small things and acting like he knew better than everyone. Turning down $500,000 felt scary, like maybe I was being stupid or too proud. But I also felt more confident about our slower path, the one where we actually controlled our own business and didn't have to answer to someone who thought quality details could wait. A month later, I was doing inventory at our main truck when Marco rushed over with his phone. A new place called Fry Crazy had just opened downtown, and their menu was almost identical to ours. They had rotisserie chicken fries, dessert fries, hot dog-flavored fries, even similar names like Cotton Candy Crunch and Strawberry Dream. I felt my face getting hot as I scrolled through their social media photos. They'd basically copied everything except our actual recipes, and I wanted to march down there and scream at whoever owned the place. Instead, I called Dean and asked if we could sue them for stealing our concept. Dean sighed and explained that recipes and flavor ideas were nearly impossible to protect legally unless we had patents, which we didn't. He said food concepts got copied all the time, and unless they were using our exact branding or claiming to be us, we didn't have much legal standing. Then he suggested something different. Focus on what actually made us special, he said. Our story, our quality, the relationships we'd built with customers over 2 years, those things couldn't be copied by just printing a similar menu. I hung up feeling frustrated but also realizing he was right. Instead of attacking Fry Crazy publicly or getting into some social media war, I spent that evening writing a long post for our business page. I thanked our customers for their loyalty and support, then told the whole story of how I developed each signature flavor. The rotisserie chicken fries came from my grandmother's Sunday dinners. The cotton candy fries were inspired by childhood trips to the fair with my dad. The strawberry cheesecake fries happened because I'd burned a whole batch one night and experimented with dessert toppings to salvage them. I shared photos from our early food truck days, talked about the struggles and failures, explained why we sourced specific potato varieties, and changed our oil twice as often as most places. The post went up around 8 at night, and by morning it had been shared over 300 times locally. Customers started commenting with their own memories of trying our food for the first time, of bringing their kids to the truck every weekend, of how our fries had been part of their birthday parties and family gatherings. Some people mentioned Fry Crazy directly, saying they'd tried it and immediately noticed the quality difference. The whole situation actually helped us because it highlighted what made us real and authentic, compared to someone just copying a concept without understanding the work behind it. 3 months later, Fry Crazy closed down. I heard about it from one of our regular customers who worked in that neighborhood. Apparently, they'd gotten terrible reviews almost immediately because their fries were soggy, their flavors tasted artificial, and their service was awful. They'd tried to copy what we did without understanding that consistency and care mattered more than just having creative menu names. I felt glad we'd been proven right, but also a little sad that they'd wasted their money and time trying to imitate instead of creating something original. The whole experience taught me that our real advantage wasn't just the flavor ideas. It was the 2 years we'd spent perfecting techniques, training staff, building systems, and actually caring about every single order that went out. In March, I was reviewing our monthly reports when I noticed something weird. Our newest restaurant location had customer satisfaction scores way lower than our other sites. The food quality ratings were okay, but service scores were terrible, and several comments mentioned rude staff and long wait times. I decided to do an unannounced visit the next day. I showed up during the lunch rush and stood in line like a regular customer, watching everything. The manager, a guy we'd hired 3 months earlier, was cutting corners everywhere. He was using cheaper oil that I could smell wasn't our usual brand. The fries were coming out pale and undercooked because he'd turned down the fryer temperature to speed up the process. When one of the younger staff members asked him a question, he snapped at her in front of customers. I felt sick watching him damage everything we'd built just to make his shift easier or save a few dollars. After the rush died down, I walked into the kitchen and asked to speak with him privately in the back office. His face went white when he realized who I was. I told him he was suspended immediately pending a full investigation, and he needed to leave the building right then. He started making excuses about tight margins and corporate not understanding real operations, but I cut him off and repeated that he needed to leave now. I spent the next week working that location myself while Brittany conducted a complete investigation into what had been happening. She reviewed all the financial records, interviewed every staff member privately, and checked supplier invoices against what we'd actually received. We discovered the manager had been stealing cash too. He'd been voiding transactions after customers left and pocketing the money, probably hundreds of dollars over the past few months. Finding out felt like getting punched in the stomach. I'd trusted him to represent our business, to treat our customers and staff well, and instead he'd been betraying everyone for his own convenience and profit. We fired him immediately and filed a police report for the theft. Then we implemented way better systems across all our locations, including surprise audits, better security cameras, and a direct hotline where staff could report problems anonymously. The whole situation cost us money and reputation damage, but I felt grateful we'd caught it before things got worse. Some of the staff members at that location admitted they'd wanted to report the problems earlier, but were scared of losing their jobs. That broke my heart because we'd always tried to create a place where people felt safe speaking up. The incident forced us to completely redo our hiring process. Brittany spent 2 weeks researching and developing new procedures that included personality tests, way more thorough reference checks and trial shifts, where we could actually watch how people worked before making them managers. She also created a secret shopper program where we'd regularly send people to test our own locations for quality and service. It added overhead costs that made our margins tighter, but protecting our reputation was worth every penny. I'd rather spend money preventing problems than dealing with the damage after they happened. One evening in April, Ian came over to my apartment with takeout from our flagship restaurant. We'd been so busy with work that we hadn't had a real date in weeks, just quick lunches between meetings and exhausted evenings reviewing reports. We sat on my couch eating our fries and talking about nothing important for the first time in forever. Then Ian set down his food and turned to face me. He said he loved how I'd built something meaningful from pain, how I fought for what mattered, how I'd taught him that success meant building something sustainable rather than just profitable. He pulled out a small box and opened it. The ring was simple and beautiful, just a single stone on a thin gold band. I started crying before he even finished asking if I'd marry him, nodding yes while tears ran down my face. We sat there hugging for a long time, both of us crying happy tears, and I felt this huge sense of rightness about everything. This wasn't like before, rushed and pressured and full of doubt I'd been ignoring. This felt solid and real, and based on actually knowing each other through hard times. Over the next few days, we talked about what kind of wedding we wanted. We both agreed on something small, just immediate family and close friends, maybe 30 people total. The idea of wedding planning made my chest tight at first, all those memories of standing at the altar in my dress flooding back. I made an appointment with Angelique to talk through my anxiety about it. She helped me focus on what I wanted this time instead of what went wrong before. She reminded me that I got to make different choices now, that I could plan something that actually reflected who Ian and I were, instead of what other people expected. Ian was incredibly patient with my occasional panic moments, never pushing me to make decisions before I felt ready. When I got overwhelmed looking at venue options, he suggested we just have it in his parents' backyard garden where we'd had our first real conversation about the business. When I started spiraling about guest lists and seating charts, he reminded me we could literally just set up chairs in a circle and skip all the traditional stuff that didn't matter to us. Slowly, wedding planning started feeling less like reliving trauma and more like creating something new and ours. A few weeks later, my phone buzzed with a text from someone I barely remembered from my ex's old social circle. The message said my ex wanted to congratulate me on my engagement and hoped Ian wasn't just a rebound. I stared at the screen for a solid minute before blocking the number without responding. Dean called that evening to check in, and I told him about the indirect contact. He made a note in his file but agreed it wasn't threatening, just pathetic. I felt annoyed more than anything, like my ex was a mosquito buzzing around that I couldn't quite swat away. Ian squeezed my hand across the dinner table and reminded me that my ex's opinion stopped mattering the day he left me at that altar. The next morning, I deleted the screenshot and refused to give it another thought. May arrived with warm weather and busy lunch rushes at all our locations. I was at the main restaurant reviewing inventory when 2 health inspectors walked in with clipboards. My stomach dropped, but I smiled and showed them around, answering every question while trying not to panic. They spent an hour checking temperatures, examining our storage areas, and reviewing our cleaning logs. When they finished, the lead inspector handed me a violation report listing 2 issues. Our walk-in cooler was running 3 degrees too warm, and we didn't have proper hand-washing signs posted in all the right spots. I felt my face burn with shame even though he said these were minor and fixable. The inspectors left and I immediately called our refrigeration company to fix the cooler, then ordered the correct signs online for overnight delivery. Brittany arrived 20 minutes later and found me scrubbing already clean counters while trying not to cry. She pulled the violation report from my hands and read it carefully before looking up at me. She said we'd use this as a chance to get better, not as proof we were failing. We spent the rest of that week visiting every location with our own checklists, checking temperatures, reviewing procedures, and making sure every detail met standards. By Friday, we had compliance checklists for each location and a schedule for weekly self-inspections. The following Monday, I sat at my laptop staring at a blank social media post. Brittany stood behind me reading over my shoulder as I typed out exactly what happened during the health inspection. I listed both violations, explained what we did wrong, and detailed every step we took to fix the problems. My finger hovered over the post button for a full minute before Brittany reached around and clicked it for me. Within an hour, 3 competitors had shared the post with snarky comments about our standards slipping, but most of the comments were from regular customers saying they appreciated the honesty and would keep eating with us. By that evening, 5 other restaurant owners had sent me private messages, thanking us for being transparent about inspections instead of hiding them. One woman said she'd had a similar violation last year and felt so ashamed she almost quit, but seeing us handle it openly made her feel less alone. I screenshot those messages and saved them in a folder labeled, "Why We Do This Right." June hit like a wall of heat and bad news. I was prepping potatoes at the truck when an old coworker from my ex's restaurant called to tell me his place had closed for good. She said the locks were changed, the equipment was repossessed, and my ex was filing for bankruptcy. I thanked her for letting me know and hung up feeling strange and hollow. Part of me wanted to celebrate that his failure proved I'd been essential to his success all along. But another part felt sad that he'd destroyed something that could have worked if he'd just been less arrogant and made better choices. Mostly, though, I just felt relieved that this whole chapter was finally, truly closed. That night, I told Ian about the closure over takeout from our restaurant. He asked how I felt, and I realized I didn't feel much of anything anymore. My ex was just someone I used to know who made a choice that ended up freeing me to build something better. The anger and hurt had faded into something more like indifference, and that felt like the real victory. Wedding planning had been going smoothly until Ian's mother called asking about the guest list. She wanted to invite 50 people from their extended family, cousins, and aunts and uncles Ian barely knew. That would triple our planned guest count from 30 to nearly 100 people. Ian and I sat on my couch that evening having a difficult conversation about what we actually wanted for our wedding day. He called his mother back on speaker and explained that we were keeping the wedding small and intimate, focused on people we actually spent time with rather than distant relatives we saw once every few years. His mother's voice went tight and hurt as she said she'd already told people to save the date. Ian stayed calm but firm, saying we understood she was excited. But this wedding was about our commitment to each other, not about putting on a big social event for the extended family. The call ended awkwardly with his mother saying she needed time to think about it. 3 days later, she called back and apologized, admitting she'd gotten caught up in what she thought a wedding should be instead of listening to what we actually wanted. Ian thanked her and promised she'd still have an important role in the small ceremony we were planning. The next step felt less romantic but more grown up. Ian and I sat in Dean's office discussing a prenuptial agreement to protect both the business and our personal assets. Dean asked detailed questions about our finances, our debts, our plans for future growth, and what would happen if things didn't work out. It was uncomfortable talking about divorce before we'd even gotten married, but it also felt responsible and mature. Ian surprised me by suggesting the business remain entirely mine since I'd built it from nothing, but I wanted him protected too since he'd helped it grow. We spent 2 hours going through scenarios and possibilities, having honest conversations about money and risk and what we wanted to build together. Dean drafted an agreement that felt fair to both of us, protecting what we'd each brought into the relationship while planning for what we'd build together. Signing those papers actually made me feel closer to Ian because we'd talked through hard stuff honestly instead of avoiding it. This wasn't like my first engagement where I'd ignored red flags and hoped for the best. This was 2 people making clear-eyed choices about their future together. July brought news I'd been half expecting but still dreaded. Dean called to tell me Winston had been released from prison after serving his 6-month sentence for the parole violation. The restraining order was still active and covered Winston as well as my ex. Dean walked me through the terms again, reminding me what distances they had to maintain and what counted as a violation. I felt nervous but not terrified like I had been the first time. The legal system had actually worked when Winston violated his parole before, and I trusted it would work again if needed. I updated Brittany and the managers at all our locations, making sure everyone had photos of both Winston and my ex with instructions to call the police immediately if either showed up. Ian offered to stay at my apartment for a few days until I felt safer, and I took him up on it. We fell asleep on the couch watching cooking shows, and having him there made the fear feel more manageable. The weeks passed and nothing happened. Winston didn't show up at any of our locations. My ex stayed silent on social media and didn't try any indirect contact. The absence of drama felt almost weird after months of constant tension and waiting for the next crisis. I kept expecting my phone to buzz with bad news or to see one of them lurking near a truck. But days turned into weeks, and the harassment just seemed to be over. Dean said it looked like Winston had finally learned that violating court orders meant going back to prison, and my ex was probably too busy dealing with his bankruptcy to bother me anymore. I started sleeping better and stopped jumping every time someone walked past the truck. The fear slowly unwound itself from my shoulders, and I began to trust that maybe this was actually finished. August arrived with our biggest milestone yet. The flagship restaurant opened in a renovated downtown space that Ian had helped us get at a reasonable lease rate. The building had tall windows, exposed brick, and enough room for 60 seats plus a small bar area. We kept the menu focused on our core fry items, but added a few specials you could only get at this location. The space felt like a grown-up version of the food truck, warm and welcoming but more polished. Opening week was busy with people curious about the new spot. We had a few small problems like the credit card system going down for an hour and running out of our dessert fries on the second night, but nothing major. Brittany and I worked every shift that first week, watching how customers moved through the space and taking notes on what worked and what needed adjusting. By Sunday evening, we were exhausted but happy, looking at numbers that showed we'd exceeded our projected sales for the opening week. The best part of the flagship opening was watching Marco step into his new role as manager. He'd started as a crew member at the original food truck, the guy who used to give customers extra large portions because he couldn't handle confrontation. Now he was running the flagship restaurant, training new staff, handling difficult customers with calm confidence, and making smart decisions about inventory and scheduling. I watched him teach a new employee the proper way to cut potatoes for our rotisserie chicken fries, explaining why the thickness mattered and how it affected the cooking time. He had the same patience I tried to have, the same attention to detail that made our food special. At the end of his shift, Marco found me in the office and thanked me for believing in him enough to give him this chance. I told him he'd earned it through hard work and growth, and I was proud of the leader he'd become. Walking to my car that night, I realized that building a team of people who shared our values and cared about quality was just as important as perfecting recipes. The business wasn't just about my fries anymore. It was about the people who made them with care every single day. 2 weeks before the wedding, Dean called me with news I wasn't expecting. My ex's lawyer had reached out requesting a final mediation session to settle everything once and for all. Dean explained that mediation could give us real closure and eliminate any remaining legal uncertainty hanging over my head. The idea of being in the same room with my ex again made my stomach twist into knots. I'd worked so hard to move past all the drama and build something good with Ian. The thought of facing my ex across a conference table felt like stepping backward into a nightmare I'd finally escaped. Ian found me sitting on our couch staring at my phone after the call ended. I told him about Dean's message and how much I dreaded the idea of seeing my ex again. Ian sat down next to me and took my hand. He said he'd come with me to the mediation for support if I wanted him there. I felt some of the tension leave my shoulders knowing I wouldn't have to face this alone. The mediation happened 3 days later in a conference room at a neutral law office downtown. The space had bland gray walls and a long table with uncomfortable chairs. My ex sat on one side with his lawyer while Dean, Ian, and I sat across from them. A professional mediator in a navy suit sat at the head of the table with a stack of papers in front of her. My ex looked terrible, honestly. His face was thinner than I remembered, and he had dark circles under his eyes like he hadn't been sleeping well. He wouldn't make eye contact with me when we first sat down. His whole body language screamed defeat, rather than the anger and bitterness I'd seen during previous confrontations. The mediator started by explaining the ground rules and asking both sides to state what they hoped to accomplish. Dean spoke for us, laying out our desire for permanent mutual non-contact terms and a formal end to all business-related claims. My ex's lawyer responded in a tired voice that mirrored his client's defeated appearance. They were willing to agree to everything we wanted. No more contact except through lawyers if absolutely necessary. My ex would formally withdraw all his ridiculous claims about trade secrets and business interference. Both parties would agree not to trash each other publicly on social media or anywhere else. The mediator drafted the agreement language while we sat in awkward silence. Nobody admitted fault or apologized. We just agreed to leave each other alone permanently and move on with our separate lives. I signed the papers with a shaky hand. My ex signed without looking at me once. The whole session took 90 minutes and felt surreal in how calm and professional it stayed. No yelling, no accusations, Just paperwork and legal language putting an official end to a conflict that had consumed way too much of my energy. Walking out of that building into the afternoon sunlight, I felt physically lighter than I had in almost 2 years. The weight I'd been carrying around finally lifted off my shoulders. Ian squeezed my hand and looked at me with genuine pride in his eyes. He told me I'd done it, that I'd built something incredible and protected it through everything. He said he was so proud of me. Hearing those words from him made tears spring to my eyes, but they were good tears for once. That night, I slept peacefully for the first time in months. I didn't wake up at 3 in the morning wondering what my ex would try next. I didn't check my phone compulsively for threatening messages or legal notifications. I just slept deeply and dreamlessly, finally free from waiting for the next crisis or confrontation to explode in my face. Our wedding day in September arrived with perfect weather and clear blue skies. We'd planned everything to be exactly what we wanted, small and intimate and focused on actual commitment rather than putting on a show. The ceremony happened in a garden venue with 28 guests sitting in white chairs arranged in a small circle. My mom cried happy tears. Ian's parents beamed at us from the front row. Brittany and Marco sat together looking genuinely thrilled to be there. We exchanged vows we'd written ourselves, promising to support each other's dreams and communicate honestly even when it was hard. We promised to build a life based on real partnership rather than performance or trying to impress anyone. When Ian kissed me after we were pronounced married, I felt pure joy instead of the anxiety that had plagued my first wedding attempt. I felt completely present in the moment instead of haunted by past betrayals and fears about the future. This was real and solid and based on 2 years of actually building something together through challenges and growth. The reception was casual and fun, held in the same garden with string lights and a simple buffet dinner. My father stood up during dessert to give a toast that caught me completely off guard. He talked about watching me turn heartbreak into purpose and build something meaningful from the worst day of my life. His voice got thick with emotion when he apologized for not fully supporting my cooking dreams earlier, for dismissing them as just a hobby instead of recognizing my real talent and drive. He said he was proud of the businesswoman I'd become, and the way I'd handled everything with strength and grace. The public acknowledgement from my dad healed something inside me I didn't even realize was still wounded. I'd always felt like he saw me as less serious or capable than my siblings. Hearing him say those words in front of everyone we loved made me feel truly seen and valued by him for the first time. We left the next morning for our honeymoon in a small coastal town 3 hours away. I'd been nervous about unplugging from the business for a whole week, worried that something would go wrong without me there to handle it. But Ian convinced me that we'd built good systems and trained good people specifically, so we could take real breaks. Brittany and Marco promised to handle everything and only call if there was a genuine emergency. For 7 days, I didn't check work emails or call the restaurants to see how things were going. Ian and I walked on the beach every morning, ate fresh seafood, and just enjoyed being newlyweds without any stress or obligations hanging over us. When we got back and checked in with Brittany, she reported that everything had run smoothly. They'd handled a minor equipment issue at one truck and dealt with a difficult customer complaint without needing my input at all. Coming back to work after a real break, I felt refreshed and genuinely excited rather than exhausted and obligated. I realized I'd been running on empty for months and desperately needed that time away. October brought a difficult business decision we'd been avoiding for weeks. Our smallest restaurant location had been consistently losing money, despite multiple attempts to turn it around. The neighborhood demographics just never quite matched our concept. We'd tried different menu options, adjusted our hours, ran promotions, but nothing seemed to work. The location kept draining resources we could use better elsewhere. Brittany, Ian, and I sat down with the numbers and finally admitted we needed to close it. Making that call felt terrible at first. I kept thinking about the staff who would lose their jobs and the customers who did love that location, even if there weren't enough of them. We spent 2 weeks helping every staff member either transfer to our other locations or providing good severance packages and strong references for other jobs. Marco personally called each employee to explain the situation and make sure they had support during the transition. We posted a heartfelt message on social media thanking the neighborhood for their support and explaining our decision honestly. Closing that location felt like failure initially, like I'd somehow messed up or not tried hard enough. But Brittany sat me down and reframed it completely. She explained that knowing when to cut losses was actually smart business, not failure. Continuing to pour money into a location that wasn't working would have put our successful locations at risk. We needed to protect what was working, rather than desperately trying to force something that wasn't. We spent an afternoon analyzing exactly what went wrong with that location. The neighborhood was too residential with not enough foot traffic during our peak hours. The nearby competition was too strong. The parking situation was terrible. We documented all these lessons to use when evaluating future expansion opportunities. I realized that not every location would work, and that was genuinely okay. The key was learning from it, rather than seeing it as some kind of personal defeat. A food industry publication reached out in late October, asking to interview me for a piece about women entrepreneurs in the restaurant business. I was hesitant at first, worried about drawing attention or inviting more drama. But the writer seemed genuinely interested in the real challenges of scaling a food business, rather than just wanting gossip about my personal life. During the interview, I shared honest details about the difficulties of maintaining quality across multiple locations, the importance of building good systems and training programs, and how personal crisis had become professional motivation for me. I talked about the supply chain issues we'd faced, the staffing challenges, the financial pressures of growth. The writer asked thoughtful questions and really seemed to understand the complexity of what we'd built. The article published a few weeks later, and several young women reached out afterward saying my story had inspired them to pursue their own food business dreams. Reading their messages made me realize I'd accidentally become a role model for other people trying to build something from scratch. By November, our business had settled into a stable rhythm. We had 2 food trucks and 2 restaurants, all consistently profitable with strong customer loyalty in each location. We weren't growing explosively anymore, but we were sustainable and steadily building real equity. Ian and I sat down one evening to discuss potentially opening 1 more location the following year. But this time we approached it completely differently than our earlier rapid expansion. We agreed we'd only move forward if we found the absolute perfect spot with the right demographics, foot traffic, and competitive landscape. We'd only open if we could staff it properly with well-trained people who understood our quality standards. Growth just for the sake of growth didn't appeal to either of us anymore. We'd learned that sustainable success meant being selective and strategic, rather than just constantly chasing bigger numbers and more locations. A few weeks later, I sat in Angelique's office for what I knew would be one of my last regular sessions. She asked me to walk through everything that had happened since that day at the altar, and I started talking about the wedding dress, the waiting, the humiliation. But as I described it, the words felt distant, like I was talking about someone else's life. Angelique leaned forward and asked the question I'd been avoiding. How did I feel about my ex now, really? I sat there for a long moment, searching for anger or hurt or even satisfaction about his failures. Instead, I just felt nothing. He was someone I used to know who made a choice that accidentally freed me to build something better. The anger had faded months ago without me even noticing. I told Angelique that I was grateful, which surprised both of us. Grateful that he left, grateful that I had to figure things out alone, grateful that I learned I could handle hard things. She smiled and said that was real healing. Not the dramatic kind where you confront someone and get closure, but the quiet kind where you just stop caring and move forward. The holidays came fast, and Ian and I decided to host a small dinner at our apartment for the people who'd actually supported us through everything. Brittany arrived first with a bottle of wine and immediately started helping me set the table. Marco showed up next with his girlfriend, then Dean with his wife. We kept it simple, just pasta and salad and garlic bread, nothing fancy. When everyone was seated, Ian stood up and raised his glass. He said we were toasting to second chances, to building something that mattered, and to the family you choose instead of the one you're born with. Everyone clinked glasses, and I looked around the table at these people who'd shown up when things got hard. Brittany, who took my chaotic food truck operation and turned it into a real business. Marco, who started as a crew member and became someone I trusted to run an entire restaurant. Dean, who dealt with all the legal chaos and never made me feel stupid for asking questions. These people had my back when I needed it most, and sitting there with them felt more like family than any blood relation ever had. New Year's Eve arrived cold and clear, and Ian and I stood on our apartment balcony watching fireworks explode over the city. He wrapped his arms around me from behind, and I leaned back against him, feeling completely safe. I thought about standing at that altar 2 years ago in my wedding dress, waiting and humiliated and broken. I never could have imagined ending up here, running a business that actually worked, married to someone who treated me like an equal partner, finally trusting my own choices. Life didn't turn out how I planned it. It turned out better because I built it myself, made my own decisions, learned from my mistakes. The future stretched out ahead of us, wide open and full of things I couldn't predict. But for the first time in my life, that didn't scare me. I wasn't worried about what might go wrong or whether I could handle it. I knew I could handle whatever came next because I'd already survived the worst and turned it into something good. The fireworks kept going, bright colors lighting up the sky, and I squeezed Ian's hand. This was my life now, the one I chose, the one I earned. And it was exactly where I wanted to be. And that's the end of this story. I always hope you take something from these moments that you can actually use. Even one small insight is worth it. Subscribe so you are ready when the next one drops.